So what I think we'll end up doing is I'm just going to show you guys some apps that I've written, and we're going to talk about the processes involved and little tricks and things that I think should be considered in writing any sort of case. Which is to say that, like, obviously, much like most things that you can learn or do in debates, it's only going to get better with the number of times you do it. A good example of this that could probably be seen is, like, we have a Dropbox now, or Western has a Dropbox, that is roughly 3 years of files. Of those files, over 150 of them are mine. The difference between NPTE, my second year of debate, versus the 4th year of debate is a reflection of that process and also how teams and files alter or change over time. Now, there's a bit of a theoretical difference in... Okay, so quick background for you as to how we're going to break it down, no worries. I'm going to pull up some cases or PMCs, and we're going to talk about the processes that were involved in writing that, things that should be thought about or considered in writing it, and must-haves and must-not-haves, things like that. So, sorry. Okay, so one of the theoretical discussions that I heard once from a couple of Oregon debaters was, in their case, or in their partnership, this was Katie and Megan, they talked about how some of them would split up prep time for topic areas, you know, like pre-tournament prep, as, like, Katie would write the AFs. No, Katie would write the AFs. Megan would write the AFs, and Katie would write the ops strategies based on their speaker positions. I don't think that I would recommend that to people just because I don't think that most people are generally disciplined or diligent enough to be reading both of those things. What I would instead recommend is that your MG, at the bare minimum, has to know everything they possibly can about the case, because if they don't know the tricks and the nuances of it, you're probably in for a bad time. It was Willie VT, and I'm sorry to name drop, I just feel that Stephen Moncrief urge to cite people as I'm going. Willie VT that talked about how it should always be the MG that writes out the plan text. That, at the very least, means that you are guaranteed that the MG knows exactly what the plan is doing. Questions so far? General thoughts? All right, let's go to... Sorry, trying to think of a good one. Okay, yes, this was my favorite, writing the South China Sea AF. And this was for the Bellevue topic areas last year, which, not to brag, but B-Silk and I were in finals at. The idea in writing an AF is that you want to be tricky, but you don't want to get too cutesy in what you're doing. In this case, we understood that the resolution was going to mandate that we get involved in China, militarily intervening in the South China Sea. So the strategy from that point became, how do we make China mad enough that the plan does something, but at the same time, we don't piss them off? And so our solution to this became deploying the Coast Guard to the South China Sea. Simple enough, and one of the joking T standards that we had was that if somebody read T against us, our answer on the standards debate would be something to the effect of, you tell somebody from the Coast Guard they're not a part of the US Armed Forces. Okay, so breaking it down from top to bottom, I think that when writing a PMC, the best PMCs, one, have to remain concise, but two, every little bit on there has to become a piece of offense or a function for you in one way or another in the round. This means that my background points should become in theory, hidden non-uniques or answers to arguments that they could be making down the road. At the same time, you're not attempting to telegraph it. Likewise, I think that what you will see in many upper division rounds, particularly with college teams that are more predisposed to a faster technical policy style type of debate, is the foregoing of backgrounds altogether, which is kind of rare, but I've seen teams do it, and it really has no adverse effects. I would say that times when background points become most important is when you have a judge that is probably not as savvy or heavily involved in the community, or for that matter, is a little more traditional than not. So be considering that background points obviously don't have to be too long. As you can see from the tag up here for my claims, all of these arguments are basically just serving as uniqueness points as to why there is the propensity for conflict, or why conflict might be inevitable now. You can see there that I have a plain text. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So with the background, you were saying that you want it to be like a hidden argument. So you do that by saying like the status quo is shit. So like, and then if they don't attack it, you can bring it back up. Or
yes and no, because obviously you don't want to be reading your uniqueness arguments too soon, and maybe this is a little too convoluted and confusing for my level of explanation. I think that the best background arguments are both brief, but at times you can be hiding arguments there or in the solvency.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think what she's asking is, like, I think the utility is when you're predicting what the negative is going to read. So, like, in this case with China, you could maybe predict that a United Nations counterplan is coming up. So Zerby here included that the United Nations has failed to resolve the conflict.
Right.
Okay, so the background is just a preview on what might go on during a debate,
That's
and
what
you're
we
just
tried
kind of
to do.
filling everybody in?
Sorry, backing it up even further.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, there's, they assigned me to lots of intro-level lectures, and I kind of want to jump the gun on everybody. The background normally is the point in the case construction where you're simply going out of your way to explain what the resolution might be discussing. So like right here, the resolution is increased military presence in the South China Sea, and then this is explaining what's going on in the South China Sea right now. And as Corey so well puts, which makes me look bad, but it's also very good, is, because I wrote the case, is that there are arguments already in my background that are hedging against a discussion of the UN. If somebody were to read a UN counterplan, they have to answer these arguments about UN solvency or the capacity to do so. So it's like, in stating what has previously happened, you can still be hedging against potential arguments that you might see down the road. And what I really, really want to instill in all of you is that in writing these cases, every argument has a function in one way or another. For example, the first argument here highlights that China is rejecting all of these things now. This would seem to hedge against status quo solves arguments. The second argument would probably undercut politics because it's talking about how this is already in discussions now, meaning that there's not a lot of uniqueness game on that particular question. So just be thinking about how your arguments can cut them off at the pass. And then you can see there's our plan text. I think that in writing AFs, and certainly whenever Western writes AFs, we definitely make an effort ahead of time to be like, okay, this might be questionably topical. What that means is that your file should include a discussion of how the military, or how in this case the Coast Guard is meeting the resolution. Just writing those out ahead of time, thinking of standards, looking into military definitions, depending on what the resolution is, will obviously help you a lot in that. And for those of you that are also new in constructing cases, always, always, always give a copy of your plan text to your opponents in front of certain judges. If you don't do this, a quick procedural is the round. And certainly, we've beaten a team on not giving us a counter plan text, and had they pressed us on a plan text, would have been a different round. Solvency. Solvency is another place where you can also hide spike arguments. Yeah.
Sorry, I would just add one thing. One thing that I've started using is carbon paper. Which you can get at any like office supply store. They call it like 3-part forms, but basically what it is one sheet of paper that you can write the copy of your plain text on, then you separate it in 3 copies.
Very cool.
That's great. McHenry actually started doing that a couple of years ago. I thought it was really cool. Went into a copy supply store and they were quite confused when I asked for it. Didn't get it. Other thing that some teams do is sticky notes, because you can just pull those right off the paper and hand them off. Solvency. Solvency is an explanation as to how either functionally your actor is able to accomplish this, or what the plan text looks like. In cases where you're passing a particular piece of legislation, that solvency might be an explanation as to what that legislation is. In this case, you can see that I'm clarifying what the Coast Guard would be conducting in this case, which is illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. And I talked about those things in detail. Likewise, you can see I have more preemptive arguments that attempt to hedge back against politics scenarios, and for that matter, I have a defense of my actor in each of these cases. Down here, I talk about how and why China would have a propensity to come to the table or want to agree with a problem like this. Moving on to the advantages. Something that's very important to remember with both of your advantages is that they should be distinct from one another. This will get you out of things like a counterplan. In this case, I have arguments embedded within this that are specific to why the US would be the best actor in this case. For example, you can see that the uniqueness is tailored in such a way that says that absent the US's intervention, it's likely that conflict would take place. And I have discussions as to why the US specifically is able to resolve this. This means that even if the other team were to read a counterplan that would involve another actor, I'm still able to extend across arguments as to why they can't solve it the same way, because it's the US perceptions in relation to China that trigger the impacts. Your question?
Yeah, so, sorry if this is like going way back,
No
but,
worries.
so your advantage is going to be, so I guess what I'm asking is like, in a like hypothetical debate, we were talking about the Black Sea, what like, so would your advantage be, I don't know, I guess I don't understand like what meat of information should I put in
Oh yeah,
advantage?
no worries. That is a fun and quick explanation that we can get into right now real fast, and I don't think anyone minds. We have lots of time. Okay, so the best explanation that I ever heard for this, and honest to God, I did not hear this explanation until last year, but I was like, this is a really good way for people to grapple onto it, is uniqueness questions in either direction of the debate is a question of shit's good versus shit's bad. So all of your advantages are going to be arguments as to why shit is really bad right now. Things are really bad. That, in that case, you saw that the uniqueness said, we are going to go to war with China now, right? Mm-hmm. That means that that sets up a situation in which the plan action becomes try or die, or it becomes an instance in which there's a cost, or for that matter, like a benefit to the judge voting for the plan action in a given round, right? That means that there's only a risk that the plan can solve. Likewise, when people are arguing things in the other direction, when you're comparing your uniqueness claims as to why shit is bad to their disadvantages that say shit is good, right, disadvantages, the uniqueness will say shit is really good right now, but you're going to mess it up, or shit is getting better, but you're going to mess it up. Okay. That becomes important in the comparison of those two arguments. Distinctions between those, and that is something that SIU and Kyle Cheesewright does really well, is they carve out something super specific, and it's almost impossible to generate generics on it unless you know ahead of time what you think they're going to be doing. Good luck with that. Or, you have a parallel scenario. Does that help to explain uniqueness?
Oh yeah, definitely, thank you.
Okay, so, as we were saying before, uniqueness on an advantage is always going to be why shit is really bad now. And what I was kind of alluding to before is that more often than not, if you can frame that scenario as an inevitability absent action, then you are in a really good spot. And it's why case debate, and for that matter, I think more and more ballots tend to be going aft than not. Teams are getting better and better at leveraging these scenarios. The ability to frame your advantage or your scenario as, apocalyptic in nature, but that's neither here nor there. So you can see I have several of my claims listed there, and I have warrants subpointed as to why that is true. And the more nuance you get, the more important it is for your MG to understand every little crux of it, because these are all arguments that can be extended, applied, blah, blah, blah. All right, links. The links are the equivalent of your solvency for the advantage. This is an explanation as to why you are uniquely able to resolve the problem at hand. And the best links in any scenario are going to be able to branch off into different things. Last year, Nick Robinson gave an advanced disadvantage lecture where he was talking about how the true benefits of multiple links and internal links is that once people read impact D or internal link D, well then you still have a separate scenario as to how conflict comes to be. Backing this up a little bit, links are explanations as to why your actor is uniquely able to resolve the conflict now. You'll notice that all of my arguments here are specific to the US. This is also hedging against a counterplan in how it works. These are all discussions of why the US is able to moderate, how they have the capacity to do so, why it would already be expected. And then the internal link talks about a couple of different scenarios in which conflict could take place. The internal link is the explanation between your solvency explanation and your impact scenario that is a discussion of what could go wrong and how it could go wrong. It's kind of this muddled thing, and some people, especially more old school people, don't really understand the difference between what a link and an internal link is, because it's a very muddled thing. How I conceptualize it or think of it is, like, for example, if somebody were reading a politics disadvantage, the links might be how the GOP or why the GOP gets pissed off. The internal links is an explanation of what they do. Does that make sense? It's kind of like the next step in the causal chain as to how things go bad. And remember that if you have distinct internal links, then you could go for different impact scenarios. For example, one of these scenarios, the top one, talks about how the Philippines specifically would go into conflict, even though the reality is between me, you, and everybody else in this room, Philippines don't have the capacity at all. The second argument here talks about the propensity for like an arms buildup or the draw-in of other people that also have stakes. So that's more of an economic claim. And then you can see the impact scenario. And once you get a little older and more experienced, or for that matter, when you're not prepping your cases ahead of time, a lot of impacts are just the same regurgitated thing, which is to say people will use the same impacts every time. Somebody shoots, or 2 years from now, somebody can say you impact out war with China, and you could probably spit that out for them. My advice to you in that is the more distinct or unique of an impact that you have, the more difficult it is for other people to read types of impact defense. Additionally, in writing out a PMC, be considering as you are doing it whether or not you want impact framing arguments. Brendan Silk is giving a lecture later on about what that looks like more specifically. That is when you want to be tailoring or explaining why your impact is first, why it should be prioritized. If you were debating Gingy in the back, he would probably be reading very specific impact framing that is unlike if you were to be hitting somebody that is simply going for nuclear war and extinction claims. Everybody has their own explanation of impacts and what that gets to terminalization. My partner and I would basically say, well, once things get contaminated by nuclear weapons, it kills the water table, and the water table is key to all life on Earth. Obviously, that lends itself to impact about how people won't attack because the space there, but whatever. Come up with your own impacts, it's kind of fun. You can see here I get a little sarcastic at the end of mine because I find it obnoxious. World wars were fought with an archduke. There's no reason why people wouldn't fight with islands over goats on them. Okay, so what's a little different from this app than other apps that I've traditionally written is this is obviously still accomplished vis-a-vis stopping illegal, unregulated fishing and shit like that. And you could see that this is just like another component of the case. You can see that there's still solvency and explanations as to how the Coast Guard is able to do this. It's a little different in that sometimes my advantage twos would be a lot more generic. And something to keep in mind at a lot of these tournaments, and especially with larger teams, this is when you have a larger team or when you're facing a larger team. You will see teams read the same generic advantage repeatedly. A fairly good example of this would be the number of times my partner and I collectively saw the Lewis and Clark hedge ad one or add to lends itself to, if you know going into a debate with them that they're probably going to be reading that same stock advantage with the same uniqueness, you can probably prep that ahead of time and make it hell on them in your debates. Does that make sense? So other thing to keep in mind between your two advantages. You'll notice that my first advantage gets to extinction vis-a-vis conflict, nuclear war, World War III, whatever you want to call it. My second one is different in that I talk about biodiversity loss, quality of life, and mass poverty that comes as a result of overfishing that takes place there. You'll notice that these are two different advantages, but still meeting the threshold of what does everything have to impact out to. Do you know the answer to that?
Death? I don't know.
Death or dehumanization, or extinction or dehumanization, is the two impacts that something should always impact out to. Those are the logical extremes. And so you notice that in my other advantage, I get to the other one. And so it creates a situation in which, in terms of strategic flexibility, you could be going for either one of these in the PMR and framing them as the most important impact. Likewise, if they read Impact D on your advantage one about nuclear war, and any of their scenarios also involve something remotely similar, that could be cross-applied, and you could just be going for your advantage too. Questions so far? I guess we could talk briefly about don'ts of a PMC, well, more like don'ts / for your considerations. For the most part, it is widely agreed upon that you do not read an advantage that is predicated off of a politics scenario. This is because it is easily counterplanned out of. The other team could simply read a counterplan that passes your bill or passes some other component of it that short circuits the entirety of your half. The other thing I would say is, in terms of considerations, once you get into higher level rounds or even mid-level rounds, you will see teams read preemptive or, okay, sorry. Really quickly, going back to the top, something that I abandoned doing, but other teams still do, is they'll read at the top the resolution, and then they will read that the round should be evaluated based on net benefits. A lot of national level tournaments, it is already accepted that you're going to be debating net benefits. I just kind of find it silly to read that, given that the way that you are structuring your app is entirely that to begin with. Yeah.
Okay, so like you were saying, but people will sometimes say weigh the round on net benefits. I had a round with a criterion in it. Is that what that should
That's
net benefits
tricots.
should be?
There originally in Parley was 3 different types. It's like fact, value, which is criterion,
Right.
and policy or net benefits. This lecture, and I personally am not equipped to discuss tricots. People that are attempting to evaluate the debate based on a criterion or value, I think that you have a couple of choices in that, and in fact you'd probably be deploying both of those things. The first of which is to read a procedural that says tricot is bad, and that you should be forced to debate a policy or a net benefit option. The second of which, as I am only familiar with because of Mr. Nims here, is to engage the discussion, which is to just say, well, I guess I'm just going to have to answer the case arguments and try to adapt what I do have to what they are reading specifically. And I hope you don't mind me using our round as an example. We were in California, my partner Biselk and I, and we were about to hit a Nevada team with an older classical judge in the back. By that I mean like California old, has very different understandings of Parley than our hippie Western ways were. This is a guy by the name of Todd Guy. And he said in his judging philosophy that he was probably down for whatever, and that we could speak fast. And we're like, well, maybe we'll have a policy debate. We get to the round, and we were neg, and Corey and Jacob decide that they are going to make it a value discussion because the resolution was something to the effect of privacy ought to be valued over economic wealth
In
something.
Brazil.
Or something in Brazil. And so they get up and they read it as a value and they talk about the importance of privacy. And we kind of looked at our crap and it was like, oh, God damn it. You know, it was just, so I got up and I became the most Republican I will ever be in around, and I talked about the economic importance, or how the economic importance was a prior question to that of their value in the round, which was privacy in that case. And I dropped all of the standard GOP lines, and I talked about trickle-down economics and a rising tide lifting all ships. And so I would say that in an instance in which somebody presents a value, that kind of gives you room to make whatever you want a value for that, whether that's the economy or magic or liberty. I don't know. I don't really have a lot of experience with that type of debates, but I would imagine that if you talk with the Chiefs a little bit about Tricon, he's got more knowledge on that than just about anyone, much like most of the subject matters that are being covered or discussed here. Okay, so let's talk more about case writing. Another thing that could be particularly helpful in your case writing is the process of writing out or brainstorming MG answers. Every case that you have is going to have another team that's neg, even though you don't want them to be there, and they will be thinking of ways in which they could read a counterplan or a criticism to necessarily indict what you're saying. And I would say, just as a general aside for the youngins out there, every round you go into, you should be in or have, by the time your LOC starts, a counterplan or a criticism or a hell of a lot of status quo solves arguments. You want to be undercutting the other team from Jump Street. Your job in brainstorming MG answers is to understand, or for that matter, predict what arguments might be coming about. And you can see in my MG answers, I came up with reasons as to why China doesn't freak out, why, that's probably an answer in the wrong direction, but I copy-pasted answers to a Japan rearm disadvantage. Well, I didn't copy-paste that. You see that I have T answers here to military troops, and how the Coast Guard is a part of that. Brief T answers here to what military pressure looks like. I even have answers to an Australia counterplan, in addition to a disadvantage to an Australia DA, I guess, or maybe that was supposed to be CP, and then that's some notes to me and the rest of the team. Then you see here I have answers to an Asian counterplan. So it's just predicting, I would say from a counterplan standpoint, the most likely other actors that could be, in this case, this was just like what our other file says. So it was just predicting what other actors could potentially come about. I have answers to what the ICJ would also do. I probably am missing some pretty obvious actors here, like Russia or some crap like that. But in any case, that is what the process of writing MG answers looks like. And they're important to your files only insofar as that amount of research is just one more argument you have in your head for when something goes different or wrong in the round, if you pick up what I'm saying in this case. It's all of these little things. It's kind of obnoxious because the number of times you would probably actually see Australia, next to none, but understanding both ends of the US-China relations debates, understanding the nuances of your case will make it so you own the round. And it's kind of this nasty thing where all topic area tournaments, you basically have unlimited time to craft this AF, and every little thing you can get in there is just one more step up the ladder. Each step we take, we're going to get just a little bit better. So that was that. Any questions? Yeah.
Okay, so I missed the flowing lab. So if I was to write this out, I see people put this on like different papers. So you kind of broke it down. So the background would be on a different paper, correct?
The back.
Or the like.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is how I have it conceived, and if like this would work, let me know. So like the background would be a piece of paper. The plan text I'd just hand out to everybody, and it would also be like on the same paper as the background, like framework. And then solvency is its own sheet. Advantage is its own sheet. Links and impacts are the same sheet.
Okay, so how I do this, and this will vary based on your preference, your coach's preference, and maybe like 1% of it is what your partner thinks, is I will have on the first sheet of paper, like when prep time starts, I'll write down the resolution, and then I'll flow the background, then there'll be the plan text, and there'll be solvency, depending on how much solvency I have. Traditionally, Western teams will only have maybe 1 or 2 solvency arguments, so it being flowed in shorthand all goes on the same thing. But the advantages, like advantage 1, the uniqueness, links, and impacts, I will have all flowed on the same sheet of paper. The advantage 2, I will have flowed on a separate sheet of paper. This allows for things like, if they aren't going to touch the advantage 2, then I don't need that sheet of paper. Likewise, if I was going to kick a sheet of paper, then I can just remove that piece. You're never going to be kicking your plan text, or maybe you could, we did that once. But yeah, I mean, it all depends. Just whatever works best for you is what I would say.
Okay. And do solvencies ever go after an advantage? Because some person in a round that we had like read something and then started their solvency.
Right. The links that I showed you on the advantages,
Okay.
those are also sometimes just referred to as solvency. There's a different structure to the way that people write apps, and when Colin Patrick became my coach, he and Steve Woods actually had a disagreement over this. Some people will structure their advantages as harms, which is the inherency or the uniqueness. They will have it as harms, impacts, and then solvency, which is an old school structure for it. And then basically that's a fancier or a different way of saying the uniqueness, the impacts, and then the links and the solvency are one and the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that makes sense.
so it's just like the same thing. That's still, yeah. In terms of answering case, just since you have more questions,
No, I'm just.
let me know. In terms of answering case, I think that it would behoove you all to spend lots of time answering case. It made the biggest difference between between my last year of debate and the year before that. As I was saying at the beginning of lecture, teams are becoming better and better at leveraging their case. The sooner you can cut them off, the better. And as one coach observed, while teams are getting better at leveraging their cases, MGs are not getting a lot better at defending it. And I mean, that's kind of where creativity becomes a real ball buster to other people along the way. Guess we could talk about the research component of it. I don't have a particularly good research strategy or method. I'm kind of like, I'll go to The Economist or Foreign Affairs, I'll find the topic in question, and I'll open 8 freaking different tabs, and I will go through and I will decide which arguments I want. Although I would say that on the whole, you can usually, like, if you have a difficult time writing AFs, or, you have to write an AF during prep time, it's pretty easy once you know what the bill or the thing in question is to extrapolate an advantage and an advantage 2 based on those 2 things. Does anyone know what 2 things that can be taken from? Well, I'm about to tell you. The first of which is like if the resolution involved China and India disputes, right? Then you could probably glean really fast that the two are headed for conflict in one way or another. So the advantage one would be China-India conflict going hot, right? Likewise, you can extrapolate that you're able to solve for that, and that your impact is if the two go to war, it draws in the US because of security agreements. And it's like, bam, you already have an advantage one. Now your research process, did I say meow? Now your research process simply involves filling in the warrants or finding explanations for that. That means then that you are able to dig around and look for specific wording or policy analysts that say they're going to go to war with one another. That's where you get to find crackpots and make their words gold for 7 minutes. Yeah.
So what are like, I guess what are some common advantages? Like, I hate to go generic, but I just don't know enough to not be, so it's like what are some?
Okay, along the lines of what I was telling you about Lewis and Clark, and you'll basically get an understanding for this the more that you debate. I'll create a common list, and people should feel free to shout them out. Global warming, hedge, soft power,
Economy.
econ. Oh, econ. Econ is the best because before tournaments, when you're sitting down and you're writing blocks, you get to just basically regurgitate all of the reasons they are wrong about the economy. Unless they're econ majors or particularly good with the econ debates, the number of shiesty debaters I have seen on the economy, it warms my heart a fair bit. Relations. Yeah. So, for example, if it was a resolution like this, you could be predicting that they would be reading uniqueness arguments about why China and India's relations are bad. In that case, if you were up, you'd be prepping the opposite direction. And I'm telling you, teams have a real bad time answering case, and if not, your ability to spit them out quickly is going to create mass havoc and problems. That's probably good for gives you a general sense. I mean, other thing that I would do sometimes is leadership, a lot of like environment ones. Likewise, you will see very generic impacts,
Okay.
such as the global warming impact, nuclear war, poverty, and for things like these generic impacts, over the course of your career, or hopefully before the season starts, you will come up with 3, 4, 5 arguments, all why that is an impact. Global warming isn't real, global warming is good, nuclear war doesn't lead to extinction, mad checks, we won't go into poverty defense, but those are just like generic components of a case that you will see repeatedly. And you'll find that after you've written files for a long enough period of time, what will happen is sometimes you'll copy-paste your own impacts from one file to another. I've written multiple China's files or written multiple scenarios for that, so the internal links can go into different places. And obviously, as that's happening, hopefully whoever is writing it out will have the common sense to get it all together and not just simply be stool pigeon of sorts. Yeah. So, like I was showing you up there, the advantage too that would probably be in this case, if I had to do this, would probably be a US leadership advantage. Something that is predicated off of the actor that is intervening in this. Or if like the actor had to be China, maybe some China human rights or some India politics scenario. What makes reading an India politics scenario different from if, like why I said don't have a US politics scenario is, in most cases people would probably not be able to come up with a counterplan for Indian politics.
Yeah.
And if they did, well, whoa.
Good for the crowd, yeah.
We got a badass over there, here, wherever. There are components of case construction that I'm not thinking of to talk about. What's up, Gigi? Yeah, sure. Any parts that have been particularly confusing that I can clarify? Yeah.
The internal links is a little bit confusing. I was gonna ask Cheese about it, but if you could go in a little bit more in depth on it.
Yeah, moving away from the example that I gave before, I could see how the internal links on a disadvantage would look different than that of like one on an app. In the case of this file, and hopefully I'm not just like begging the question by repeating myself, the links or the solvency explanation is simply an explanation as to why my actor is able to resolve the conflict. The internal links, as I've come to understand them, is what happens in a world absent that.
Okay.
Does that seem like a good
Yes,
explanation of what
yeah.
internal links look like
Mhm.
on cases? Yeah. So the internal links will be, okay, and then, for example, down here is like, the US Coast Guard is able to resolve overfishing, but if overfishing wasn't resolved, it hurts the economy, hurts biodiversity.
Okay.
It's like the impacts before the impacts. It's a
Mhm.
weird little marriage between the two that takes place. And if you're able to come up with multiple scenarios, that gives you inroads to multiple impacts, which means that you could kick out of one, or that they probably wouldn't answer both. Yeah, hopefully this has been a useful crash course, and you should feel free to ask me questions at any time, because we're all here to learn. I guess we could briefly talk about neg case construction. Would that be helpful at all?
Yes.
Cool. Neg case construction is a little more frustrating because you don't know what they're going to do, and that's when it becomes particularly helpful to have things like audibles or coaches to help you in prep. Let's talk briefly about audibles, because I think that every debater should learn audibles within their first 2 years of debate, because learning to adapt on the fly will make you a superior debater as opposed to one that is overly reliant on prep. So I'll talk about audibles that my partner and I had, since I don't have too much better of an example to go off of. And does everyone here understand what an audible is? All right. Audible is borrowed from football. It is basically this term used to refer to as like something that you have to do on the fly. It's changing your strategy at a moment's notice. If you are debating Hunter Sloan, and Hunter gets up and he reads DDEV, which is an argument that says we should crash the economy now, and in some cases resort to bioregions as opposed to what the plan says, then you're going to have to come up with something else than what you prepped, because you probably weren't expecting that. So Brendan and I had a few criticisms that we had memorized off the top of our head by virtue of us having read it a million different times. So you might, at the beginning of the year, know a criticism really well, or you could be new and not know what a criticism is at all. But learn what one is and be able to read it, because in most cases your criticism can link to just about everything, in which case the audible in this case might be, for example, Brendan and I were at Mile High a couple of years ago, and the other team read DDEV because the resolution was nearly impossible to accomplish, requiring trillions of dollars, so they instead decided to crash the economy. Our strategy was twofold, and I think that the first of which is something that you should always be able to do. The first strategy in the case where everything breaks down and you have nothing else to do is straight up answer the case. Non-uniques and turns. No better audible or defense than simply engaging them. That includes on things like if somebody were to read a performance, or somebody were to read a critical app. You want to engage them on the case, because you're never going to allow them to have the 7 minutes of their case uncontested. That is the first place you go. The second place you might go would be reading something like a criticism, but lucky you, you only have to be reading a criticism for 4 minutes, or maybe unlucky you if you want to read more things, because you've spent 4 minutes reading good answers to case, engaging that, or making the judge question whether or not they get full access to that. So, best audible is to read case answers. And do you understand what I say when I mean, or when I say case answers?
Yeah.
Non-uniques, answers to the relations things we were telling you become easy to generate or predict in prep based on what the resolution is. Other audible that can be come up with is a counterplan. The counterplan has become a bit of a lost or underutilized art in situations where things have broken down. We've had a round where Brendan and I counterplanned out of the word terrorist and read a terror talk pick, if you will. You can look for things within the plan text and always demand a plan text that you can be counterplanning out of. And that includes in things like criticisms. There's actually a really good round on line of Rosemary and Stephen from William Jewell debating Brandon Rivera and NAU a couple of years ago, where Brandon Rivera and partner read their classic decolonized debate, I think. I don't know. I've heard about the round. I haven't watched it. They read decolonized debates, and their plan text talks about, I think, removing whiteness from the activity. Maybe not whiteness. Maybe that's a different year and a different shtick. In any case, Rosemary and Stephen, I think, pick out of NPDA and end up cleaning their clocks on that. Thinking of clever picks or ways to, I don't know, extrapolate offense based on what the other team has done is another way of doing things. And if you weren't in a critical round, the simple act of reading a counter plan that is able to capture even one of their advantages is invaluable. The example here would be if somebody reads a China advantage and then the advantage 2 is leadership, maybe you read a Russia advantage that is able to capture the advantage 1, and then you just straight turn or turn. The advantage 2 would be what you're doing there. So in those cases, you have all of a sudden a counter plan, you have case answers, and maybe you have the entire tournament a generic politics scenario that you read along with that, because just about anything links to politics. It is very, very easy to generate a new strategy on the fly. The only thing that separates people from being able to do it and not is your unwillingness to engage in that type of creativity. I would encourage you all here, especially if you are an MG or an LO, really any position, because debate drills help everybody, especially doing different speaking positions can help you learn each of these facets. To do cold drills with your coaches, sit down with your cheese or your whoever and have them read, or your partner, I guess. Your partner works better if you can get your partner to show up. Have your cheese read an egg strat to you and answer that without any prep time, or take 2 minutes to prep and then read answers to it. Or have your cheese read a PMC that you haven't heard. Have anyone read a PMC where you don't have any prep ahead of time and have 8 minutes of going for it. The simple act or the process of reading it, repeating it, it's going to be real ugly with some really bad made-up scenarios off the top of your head to begin with. But the more that you practice it, the more that you practice with your audibles, the more that you read the news, the faster you are able to construct all of these things, and I promise you, it will make you a better debater. Partly is the activity of no prep, but also infinite prep. It is an odd activity in that the neg, hypothetically, and this is all going back to what neg case construction looks like, the neg really does have unlimited prep time. It's just a matter of making those links work and tailoring it. And the more of those tools that you have at your disposal in the realm of neg audibles, things that you've written up or scripted ahead of time, the better suited or better prepared you will be to answer, or for that matter, or to answer any sort of aff that comes your way. The more it is memorized, the more it is polished, the more that you argue it, the better you will be, and if you can memorize those with your partner, you will be even better off. And I promise if you do all of the things in this lecture, you'll be at this BNPTE this year and many years moving forward, so long as you remember those components. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask now, feel free to ask on Facebook. It is very cool how the debate community is such an open book of resources. Some of the people that I admire the most are those that ask for help constantly. Jason Hong last year really instilled in me the value of a willingness to ask or reach out to other people. I mean, it's the Gandhi quote, share your knowledge, or not Gandhi, that's the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama says, share your knowledge, it will make you immortal. People in the debate community love to talk about debates, they love to share what they know. Obviously this is a simplified, but at the same time, convoluted lecture, but I hope that you took important things from it, whether or not that's the value in audibles and case debates, or for that matter, the distinction between, in the case of the case, when shit is bad, and in the case of disadvantages, when shit is good. In either case, make comparative claims, argue, have lots of warrants, write good PMCs because you only get one shot at writing them and one shot at reading them.